The European Union's latest sanctions have not only targeted Russia's shadow fleet and key individuals facilitating its war efforts, but also extended to Chinese entities for the first time, marking a shift in how the EU approaches sanctions on foreign actors aiding Moscow. Meanwhile, the bloc faces internal discord over proposed sanctions on Georgia amid its crackdown on pro-European protests. What do these developments mean for global geopolitics and EU unity? Joining us today on TVP World to discuss these is Sergey Vakulenko, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good afternoon.
Can you help us understand how significant is the inclusion of Chinese entity in the latest pack of sanctions? And, well, what does this signal about the current state of EU-China relations?
That's EU is following the US steed. It realizes that it's not enough to sanction Russian entities alone, that to make sanctions biting, EU really has to address the counterparties that Russia is dealing with. Still, European sanctions mechanisms are much weaker than the American ones because American sanctions actually make it a crime in many circumstances for the foreign parties to violate sanctions, even if a transaction happens offshore quite far from the US soil. That's not the case for Europe, but EU is showing a resolve that even third country parties are not immune from this sanctions mechanism. So it's just a reality. Otherwise, these sanctions would be absolutely toothless. What is EU trying to do at the moment is to add some tooth to it.
Right. Perhaps this is high time to close up some of these loopholes that Russians have been abusing. Well, but given the economic challenges facing EU nations like Germany, for example, which rely on trade with China, is there actually enough political will to fully enforce these sanctions?
It's often a difficult choice. It's almost impossible to create sanctions that would be bitter and biting for the other side without imposing costs on yourselves. Just any kind of warfare, economic warfare, has costs for both parties. So it's really a choice how much a country is prepared to pay for its ethical and political ideals, for its military goals, and how much economic damage to suffer. Of course, for Germany and China, German-Chinese relationship, the concern is whether there will be any backlash from Chinese side for sanctioning Chinese companies. So far, of course, these are small and obscure Chinese companies, and so far, China hasn't shown any enthusiasm for striking back. So far, it's a bit safe. Whether it's going to expand if, for example, Germany would start to sanction Chinese refiners that buy Russian oil, this is an open question, but we are not there yet.
Right, and like you mentioned earlier, for these sanctions to actually have some bite, we do need to make sure that it is properly enforced and there's no way around it. Now, talking about the shadow fleet, we do know that it has been a tactic for Russia to evade sanctions for years. Why is the EU acting decisively against it only now?
There were hopes that the sanctions would work without this explicit listing of the ships. But to be honest, this listing of the ships doesn't add much to the sanctions. Because even before, these ships were prohibited from obtaining services in European ports. And now, well, these ships can go around Europe without stopping by a European port for refueling, bunkering as it's called, or getting some foodstuffs from it. So it is an inconvenience, but not really a biting sanction.
Right,
it's a step in a strong direction, but not more than that, just a step.
And well, we're looking at the first time that countries that are not just Russia being sanctioned. We're seeing those involved like China, North Korea. What does this message? What is the EU sending message to the global community?
EU is clearly trying to implement what's called economic statecraft, to add sanctions to its arsenal. EU barely had any sanction policies until 2022 and is now trying to catch up with the US. EU is trying to make its sanctions policy matter and work, and that's what the EU is trying to do. But there is a lot of work to do. US have been honing their sanctions policies for more than 50 years. US have strong execution bodies that look at sanctions enforcement. EU still has to build this thing. And also in the European Union, much of the enforcement is done on national levels. And whatever decisions are made at the level of the Union, the enforcement is still done by the national governments. And there, of course, the enforcement is rather patchy.
I would like to also focus on the situation in Georgia. Speaking of sanctions, we do know that the sanctions proposed by Kaja Kallas targeting the Georgian government officials have been vetoed today by Hungary and Slovakia. Is there anything else the European Union or Europe can do to help Georgia in their aspirations for the EU and their struggle for freedom?
I guess there is an argument in Europe between various members of the Union how much of political activism Union should pursue. And indeed, well, there are differences of opinions. Well, there are conservative countries like Slovakia and Hungary thinking that Europe should mind its own business and let the other countries to decide which path they would like to follow, while other countries think that Georgia is a battleground between European ideals and Russian influence. So it's really difficult. It's on country by country basis. And there are countries in Europe, like Baltic countries, that have applied these sanctions on the country level. So probably few things could be done on country by country basis.
Now, the current pro-European president, Salome Zurabishvili, is saying that she will not resign. Do you think that the ruling party will eventually remove her by force? What scenarios are we looking at?
It's an interesting situation. I think we're even past this date. Well, her term, I think, has expired on 14th of December. And indeed, the ruling party probably has the levers and control over security forces and to declare her former president, to create a new president and elect a new president and install him or her in the presidential palace. And there will be probably a clash between two presidents claiming legibility, and probably a clash between supporters of Salome Zurabishvili and the new president-elect. So most likely there will be an escalation of the tensions and probably violence in Tbilisi.
All right, so it does seem like the turmoil in Georgia is far from over. Thank you so much for helping us round up all these different topics. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
Thanks. And thank you for watching this edition of World News Tonight. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.